In New York City, we have a lot of asbestos buildings, and there's a whole debate about asbestos. I mean, a lot of people could say that if the World Trade Center had asbestos, it wouldn't have burned down, it wouldn't have melted, okay? A lot of people think asbestos, a lot of people in my industry think asbestos is the greatest fireproofing material ever made. And I can tell you that I've seen tests of asbestos versus the new material that's being used, and it's not even it's like a heavyweight champion against a lightweight from high school. But in your great wisdom, you folks have said asbestos is a horrible material, so it has to be removed.
You might ask yourself, what would happen if the man who spoke very highly of asbestos at a Senate hearing back in 2005 became the president of the United States? Since taking office, Donald Trump has rolled back 85 environmental rules and regulations, according to the New York Times, the latest of which came today, and it's a big one, when the Trump's EPA announced it is getting rid of regulations on clean water put in place under the Obama administration in 2015, which was, quote, designed to limit pollution in about 60% of the nation's bodies of water, protecting sources of drinking water for about 1/3 of the United States, end quote. Joining me to talk about the impact that this could have on the nation's water supply is Juliet Eilperin, Washington Post senior national affairs correspondent. Juliet, thank you for joining me. The question I have been asking all day when it comes to climate regulations in general, but specifically things to do with water, who wins from these things? I can tell who loses. We have two municipalities in this country that do not have safe drinking water. What does somebody get out of this?
In the case of what we're talking about in terms of this water rule, what you have is kind of a coalition of farmers, home builders, and developers. And in fact, one of the reasons why Donald Trump had been focused on this rule is because it was something that he disagreed with as a developer, that these are the constituencies who generally have to apply for permits before they undertake acts that, say, drain a wetland or might affect a stream, things like that. And so what the argument that these groups had been making is that the 2015 rule adopted under President Obama was too stringent. It overlapped with state regulations in some cases, and essentially it wasn't clear enough about when they needed federal permits, and that added to the cost of doing business.
So that, as you articulated, seems a reasonable complaint that might be addressed by better legislation or better regulation. But when you put it in the context of it being the 85th regulation that this administration has pulled out of, including the Paris climate deal, which isn't one of the 85 because it's an international agreement, it smacks of something else. Right, it smacks of not having a commitment or an understanding of climate matters and environmental matters.
Well, certainly the argument of top Trump officials, including, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency's chief, Andrew Wheeler, who my colleague Brady Dennis and I interviewed for this piece, their argument would be that there is too much regulation and that, yes, they have an outlook that they are trying to finish as many of these rollbacks as they can, ideally by the end of this year, but if not by the end of next year, so that regardless of what happens in the election, they have made their mark. And so that certainly is part of their orientation. By the EPA's own estimate, it's already rolled back roughly 46 rules at this point. And so saving, they say, over $13 billion in regulatory burdens on the private sector and individuals. And so this is certainly a focus of theirs. And yes, it transcends some of these individual issues.
The EPA, the head of the EPA, Andrew Wheeler, has expressed that the concern about climate change is overblown and that this is not a problem we're going to deal with for 50 or 75 years.
Right. We have, again, it's something that's come up many times. He does say that human activity is helping drive some of climate change, but yes, rejects the idea when he was asked, whether it is a crisis. That is something that he disagrees with. And broadly speaking, and something that, again, we raised just recently with him, his argument is that plenty of these companies, including oil and gas companies, have an incentive to restrict their greenhouse gas emissions. And so while there's a certain level of action that the federal government should take, it is certainly not an overarching driving mission of the federal government to require a number of these companies and industries to curb greenhouse gases linked to climate change.
And in fairness to a lot of our viewers who were wondering about Scott Pruitt and why he was able to hang on to his job in the face of such criticism of things that he was doing at the EPA, it's because in the mind of some people he was doing God's work. He was helping to deregulate an agency, that Republicans were very fond of in decades gone by. That's the president's work.
Yes, and it really does reflect the views of President Trump. And in fact, his top aides in these agencies, including Andrew Wheeler, one could argue is really pursuing, say, the same policy priorities as Scott Pruitt, but he's a more experienced Washington hand
right.
and is working hard to try to make sure that some of these regulations are getting across the finish line and can, to the extent they can, be defended in court.
Juliette, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me. Juliette Alperin is with us tonight.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.